My son asked why we kept feeding him every day, and I understood he'd only eaten when he earned it. Caleb had been living with me for 3 weeks when he asked the question that stopped my heart. I was making breakfast, scrambled eggs and toast, the same thing I made most mornings because it was simple, and he seemed to tolerate it. He sat at the kitchen table in the clothes I'd bought him the week before, jeans that actually fit, and a blue shirt he'd picked out himself. He watched me plate the eggs with an expression I'd started to recognize, cautious observation mixed with confusion. When I set the plate in front of him, he didn't touch it. He looked at the food, then at me, then back at the food. Finally, he said, "Why do you keep giving me food every day?" I thought he was asking about variety. Maybe he was tired of eggs. I said, "Do you want something different? I can make pancakes or cereal if you prefer." He shook his head quickly and said, "No, why do I get food every single day? What did I do to earn it?" The question hung in the air between us while I tried to process what he was actually asking. I pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. I said, "You don't have to earn food, Caleb. You get fed because you're a kid, and kids need to eat. That's how it works." He stared at me with those dark eyes that had seen too much for an 8-year-old. He said, "But I didn't do my points yesterday. I only got 6 out of 10, and the day before I got 7. You're still feeding me anyway." Points. He was talking about some kind of point system. I kept my voice calm and asked, "What are points?" He looked confused that I was confused. He said, "The things you have to do to earn meals. Make your bed perfect, no wrinkles. Clean something without being told. Answer questions right. Say yes, ma'am, and no, sir, every time. Stand up straight. Don't cry or complain. Each thing is worth 1 point, and you need 8 points to get dinner and 6 points to get breakfast." My hands were shaking, so I put them flat on the table. I said, "Caleb, there are no points here. You get breakfast, lunch, and dinner every single day, no matter what. You get food because you're my son, and I love you, and feeding you isn't something you have to earn." He processed this information slowly, his face showing disbelief. He said, "What if I'm bad? What if I don't make my bed or I talk back or I forget to say, sir?" I leaned forward and said, "Then you still get fed. Being fed isn't a reward. It's a basic thing that always happens. Do you understand?" He didn't answer, just looked at his plate of eggs that were getting cold. Finally, he picked up his fork and took a small bite, chewing slowly while watching me the entire time. I realized he was still waiting for me to take the food away, to tell him he hadn't earned it after all. I'd become Caleb's foster parent through a process that started 6 months earlier, after my wife Amanda died from cancer. We'd always planned to have kids, but the diagnosis came before we could start trying, and then there wasn't time for anything except treatments and hoping for miracles that didn't come. After she died, I was alone in our house with a guest room we'd intended to turn into a nursery. A friend suggested foster care, said Amanda would have wanted me to help a kid who needed it. I went to the orientation meeting, not really committed, but the social worker described children in the system who desperately needed stable homes, and I thought about Amanda and signed up for the certification classes. The process took 4 months of training, home studies, background checks, and interviews. My caseworker was a woman named Rita Fernandez, efficient and direct, who told me most foster parents wanted babies or toddlers. The older kids, especially those with behavioral issues or trauma histories, were harder to place. When Rita called about Caleb, she was honest about his file. He was 8 years old, had been in foster care since age 5 when his biological parents' rights were terminated due to severe neglect and substance abuse. He'd been in 4 foster homes since then, each placement disrupting for different reasons. Rita said he had trouble following rules, hoarded food, didn't sleep well, and struggled in school. She also said something in her voice that I couldn't identify at the time, a careful cautiousness when she described his last placement. She said he'd been with a foster family called the Prestons for 2 years, which was actually stable by foster care standards. But the placement ended when another foster child in the home made allegations of abuse. The investigation was ongoing, but Caleb and 3 other children had been removed as a precaution. She asked if I was willing to take an 8-year-old boy with complex needs, and I thought about Amanda and said yes. The first time I met Caleb was at Rita's office on a Friday afternoon in late September. He was small for 8, thin and wiry, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes that tracked every movement in the room. He wore clothes that were clean but ill-fitting, and he sat perfectly still in the chair next to Rita's desk, with his hands folded in his lap. Rita introduced us, and I said hello, trying to sound friendly but not overwhelming. Caleb said, "Hello, sir," in a flat, automatic voice. I told him he could call me Thomas, that sir felt too formal, but he just nodded without confirming he'd actually do it. Rita explained I was going to be his foster dad and he'd be coming to live at my house. She asked if he had any questions. He said, "No, ma'am," in that same flat voice. We talked for a few more minutes, Rita going over logistics, and the whole time Caleb sat motionless except for his eyes, which kept darting to the door. I'd prepared the guest room for him, buying new sheets and a comforter in dark blue, a desk for homework, and some books and toys based on what Rita said most 8-year-olds liked. When I brought Caleb home that evening, he walked through the house with his small backpack of belongings, examining everything with an assessing gaze. I showed him his room, and he stopped in the doorway, not entering. I asked if something was wrong, and he said, "Where do I really sleep?" I didn't understand the question. I said this was his room, his bed. He looked at the bed, then at the closet, then said, "I sleep in here? By myself?" I confirmed, yes, this was his private space. He stepped into the room carefully, set his backpack on the floor by the door, not on the bed or desk, and stood in the center looking around. He asked, "What are the rules?" I hadn't really established formal rules yet, so I said the basics. Be respectful, tell me if something's wrong, help keep things clean, do your homework. Standard stuff. He nodded and said, "Yes, sir," then asked what his chores were. I told him we'd figure out chores as we went, nothing major. Maybe he could help set the table or put his laundry in the hamper. He processed this and asked, "What time is wake up?" I said he could wake up naturally, though we'd need to get up by 7 on school days. He asked what time was lights out. I said probably around 8:30 on school nights, 9 on weekends. He asked what happened if he needed the bathroom during lights out. I said he could go to the bathroom whenever he needed to, day or night. He absorbed all of this with that same careful assessment. And I realized he was mapping the boundaries of his new environment, trying to understand the system he'd been placed into. That night, I made spaghetti for dinner and called him down when it was ready. He came immediately, sat at the table, and waited. I served him a plate, and he stared at it. I asked if he liked spaghetti, and he said, "Yes, sir," but didn't start eating until I started eating first. The first week revealed patterns that worried me, but I didn't fully understand yet. Caleb woke up at exactly 6 every morning, and I'd find him already dressed, bed made with hospital corners, sitting at his desk doing nothing, just waiting. He never asked for food, but would eat whatever I gave him, always finishing his entire plate, even if the portions were too large. He said, "Yes, sir," and "No, sir," to everything. He asked permission before doing anything, even basic things using the bathroom, getting a drink of water, touching a book on the shelf. When I told him he didn't need to ask permission for those things, he nodded, but continued asking anyway. At night, I'd hear him moving around his room, and when I checked on him, he'd be sitting on the floor beside his bed, fully clothed. I asked why he wasn't sleeping, and he said, "I'm not tired yet, sir," even though it was obvious he was exhausted. School was another challenge. I enrolled him at the local elementary school, and his teacher, Mrs. Chen, called me within 3 days. She said Caleb was academically behind, reading at a kindergarten level despite being in 3rd grade. But more concerning was his behavior in class. He never spoke unless directly called on, never raised his hand, never asked questions. He sat rigidly at his desk and flinched when she walked by. When she'd given the class free time to talk and play, Caleb had remained seated, motionless, until she specifically told him he was allowed to move. She asked if there was trauma history she should know about, and I told her what I knew, that he'd been in multiple foster homes and was adjusting to a new placement. She said she'd work with him, but recommended I consider getting him into therapy to address whatever he'd experienced. I called Rita and told her about the behaviors I was seeing. The hypervigilance, the asking permission for everything, the rigid adherence to routines he seemed to expect, but I hadn't established. Rita sighed and said this was consistent with children from highly controlling environments. She mentioned again that the investigation into the Preston home was ongoing, but so far Caleb hadn't disclosed any specific abuse. The allegations came from another child, and Caleb had been interviewed twice by investigators but said everything was fine at the Prestons, that they were good to him. Rita said this was common. Kids often protected their abusers out of fear or learned survival behavior. She recommended a trauma therapist and gave me contact information for Dr. Amy Lynn, who specialized in foster children. I made an appointment for the following week. The food hoarding started becoming apparent around day 10. I found granola bars hidden under Caleb's mattress, an apple in his closet behind his shoes, crackers wrapped in a shirt in his backpack. When I asked him about it, he immediately said, "I'm sorry, sir, I'll put it back," and looked terrified. I told him he wasn't in trouble, but I was confused why he was hiding food when I fed him 3 meals a day plus snacks. He said, "In case I don't earn dinner, so I don't get too hungry." The phrasing struck me as odd, "don't earn dinner," but I focused on reassuring him. I said he would always get dinner, that food wasn't conditional. He said, "Yes, sir," in a way that meant he'd heard me, but didn't believe me. I told him if he wanted snacks in his room, that was fine. He could keep them on his desk or in a drawer. He didn't need to hide them. He nodded, but the hidden food continued appearing in increasingly creative locations. The first session with Dr. Lynn was mostly assessment. She met with me first, and I described everything I'd observed. The rigid behavior, the excessive politeness, the food hoarding, the permission-seeking, the inability to relax. Dr. Lynn listened carefully and said these were classic signs of complex developmental trauma, likely from an environment with harsh punishment and inconsistent care. She asked specific questions about the Preston home, what I knew about their fostering practices, how many children had been in the home. I told her what Rita had shared, that they'd fostered multiple children over several years, that the investigation started when one child disclosed physical abuse, that Caleb had been removed as a precaution, but hadn't made any allegations himself. Dr. Lynn's expression darkened, and she said she'd worked with other children from homes where foster parents used punishment-based control systems, often justified as discipline. She said if Caleb had spent 2 years in that environment during crucial developmental ages, the damage would be significant. When Dr. Lynn met with Caleb, she used play therapy techniques, having him draw pictures and play with toys while she asked gentle questions. Afterward, she told me Caleb had drawn a picture of a house with many rooms and stick figures of children standing in rows. When she asked him to tell her about the picture, he'd said it was where he used to live, and those were the other kids. She asked how many other kids, and he'd counted the stick figures, 11 total, including himself. Dr. Lynn said most foster homes were licensed for 4 to 6 children maximum. 11 children in one home suggested either the Prestons were violating their license limits or Caleb's perception of how many children there was distorted by trauma. She asked if I could request more information from Rita about the Preston home, specifically how many children had been placed there and what the investigation had uncovered so far. I called Rita the next day and asked directly. How many children had been in the Preston home when Caleb was removed? There was a long pause before Rita said, "Thomas, I can't discuss details of an open investigation." I pushed back, saying I needed to understand what Caleb had experienced in order to help him heal. Rita finally said, "When we removed children from that home, we took 7 kids out, but Caleb was only there 2 years, and the Prestons have been licensed foster parents for 6 years. We're trying to track down every child who was placed there, but the records are complicated. 7 kids removed at once, at least 11 over the years if Caleb's drawing was accurate." I asked what the specific allegations were. Rita said, "The child who came forward described a strict point system for behavior. Everything they did was scored, and privileges were tied to points. Food, bedtime, free time, everything was earned or withheld based on the points." My stomach dropped, remembering Caleb's question about earning meals through points. I asked Rita if she'd specifically asked Caleb about the point system. She said yes, investigators had asked, but Caleb insisted the Prestons were nice to him and he didn't want to get anyone in trouble. Rita said many children who'd been conditioned by long-term abuse would defend their abusers. It was a survival mechanism. They'd learned that cooperation meant less punishment, so they'd continue cooperating even after removal. She said the investigation was building a case through documentation and interviews with all the removed children, but it was slow because most of the kids were too scared to talk. I asked what happened if they couldn't prove abuse. Rita's voice was grim. She said, then the Prestons could potentially fight to get their foster license back, and Caleb and the others could theoretically be returned to their care, or the Prestons could foster again. The thought made me physically ill. That evening, I sat Caleb down after dinner and said I wanted to ask him some questions about where he used to live. His whole body tensed, and he said, I don't want to get anyone in trouble, sir. I promised he wasn't in trouble, and neither was he responsible for anyone else getting in trouble. I said I just wanted to understand his old house so I could help him feel safe in this house. He nodded reluctantly. I asked him to tell me about the point system. He described it mechanically, clearly something he'd memorized. You got points for completing tasks correctly. Making your bed with perfect corners, 1 point. Completing a chore without being reminded, 1 point. Answering questions correctly, 1 point. Using proper manners, 1 point. Sitting still during instruction time, 1 point. Not crying or showing emotion, 1 point. Not asking for things, 1 point. The list went on. You needed 8 points minimum to get dinner, 6 for breakfast, 5 for lunch. If you didn't have enough points, you didn't eat that meal. I asked what happened if someone didn't get enough points multiple days in a row. Caleb's voice got quieter. He said, then you have to try harder the next day, and if you still can't get enough points, Mr. Preston would say you were choosing not to eat, that you were being defiant. I asked if Mr. Preston ever hit the kids. Caleb shook his head quickly and said, no, sir. They never hit us. They said hitting was wrong. They used better discipline. I asked what better discipline meant. He said, consequences that teach you. If you didn't earn meals, you got hungry, and that taught you to do better. If you couldn't follow rules, you lost privileges that taught you to follow rules. If you cried or complained, you had to stand in the corner until you could control yourself. That taught you self-control. They said they were helping us become better people. The words sounded rehearsed, things he'd been told repeatedly until he believed them. I asked how long the corner timeouts lasted. He said, as long as it took to learn, sometimes an hour, sometimes more. Mr. Preston said if you were still upset after an hour, that meant you hadn't learned the lesson yet. I asked if he ever had to stand in the corner for a long time. Caleb nodded and said, once I cried because I was hungry and I had to stand in the corner for 4 hours until bedtime. But I learned not to cry after that. 4 hours. An 8-year-old, probably 6 years old at the time, standing motionless in a corner for 4 hours as punishment for crying about being hungry. I managed to keep my voice steady and asked if the other kids had similar consequences. He said, yes, sir, we all had to learn. Some kids learned faster than others. The younger ones had trouble learning, so they had consequences more often. I asked how young the youngest kids were. Caleb said there were 2 kids who were 5, 3 kids who were 6 or 7, and the older kids were 8 to 10. I asked what happened to the kids who couldn't earn enough points consistently. Caleb's expression shifted to something that looked like guilt. He said, they got removed because Mr. Preston said they weren't benefiting from his structure. He'd call the caseworker and say the child wasn't a good fit for the home and they'd get moved somewhere else. He said it was their own fault for not trying hard enough. I realized the system was designed to cycle through children. The Prestons would take in foster kids, subject them to this brutal point system disguised as discipline, and when children couldn't maintain the impossible standards or their trauma responses became too visible, the Prestons would frame it as the child failing the placement. Then new kids would come in, and the cycle would repeat. It was methodical and calculated, and they'd been doing it for 6 years. I asked Caleb if he'd ever told his caseworker about the points and the hunger and the corner time. He said, the caseworkers came sometimes, but we knew to do good when they visited. Mr. Preston would tell us the day before that the caseworker was coming, and we'd have extra practice on how to act. We had to say everything was fine and we liked living there. If we said anything bad, Mr. Preston said the caseworker would take us away and put us in a worse place where we'd get hit and really hurt. He said he was protecting us by teaching us discipline the right way, and we should be grateful. The manipulation was sophisticated. The Prestons had convinced traumatized children that their abuse was protection, that speaking up would result in something worse, that they should be grateful for the cruelty inflicted on them. I asked the question I was most afraid to hear the answer to. Caleb, What was the longest you ever went without earning enough points to eat? He thought about it carefully, then said, One time I went 3 days where I only got breakfast one day because I couldn't get enough points for the other meals. I was really dizzy and my stomach hurt, but then I tried really hard and did better and earned dinner. 3 days with 1 meal total for a 6 or 7-year-old. Literal starvation used as behavior modification. I felt rage building, but kept it contained because Caleb was watching my face carefully for reactions. I said, That must have been very hard. I'm sorry that happened to you. He looked confused and said, But it was my fault, sir. I didn't earn the points. Mr. Preston said if we got hungry, it was because we chose not to do what we needed to do to get food. I told him very directly that none of it was his fault, that adults are supposed to feed children no matter what, that using food as punishment was wrong and illegal and abusive. He listened, but I could see the disbelief on his face. He'd spent 2 critical years being told that hunger was his own failure, that punishment was teaching, that abuse was protection. Undoing that conditioning wouldn't happen in one conversation. Dr. Lin had warned me that children from these environments struggled to accept kindness because they'd been programmed to believe they didn't deserve it unless they earned it. Caleb had learned to survive by meeting impossible standards, and now he was in a home where there were no standards to meet, no points to earn, no punishment for failing, and his entire framework for understanding the world didn't fit anymore. Over the next several days, I noticed more concerning behaviors now that I understood their context. Caleb would wake up at 6 and immediately start cleaning things that weren't dirty, organizing things that were already organized, trying desperately to earn points in a system that didn't exist. When I told him he didn't need to clean, he looked panicked and said, But I have to earn breakfast, sir. I sat him down every morning and told him breakfast wasn't something to earn. It was just breakfast. But the message wasn't landing. He'd pick at his food anxiously, tracking in his head whether he'd done enough to deserve what he was eating. At school, Mrs. Chen reported he was having trouble participating because he seemed terrified of giving wrong answers. When she asked him a question, he'd freeze up, and if he did answer and got it wrong, he'd withdraw completely for the rest of the day. I called Rita and told her everything Caleb had disclosed about the Preston home. The point system, the starvation, the extended corner times, the manipulation. Rita listened and said, This corroborates what we're hearing from other children. We have enough now to move forward with charges. The detective handling the case is named Angela Ortiz. She's going to want to interview Caleb again, but this time with his full disclosure. I asked if Caleb would have to testify in court. Rita said possibly, depending on how the case developed. Child testimony was difficult but sometimes necessary. She said the district attorney was building a case not just for child abuse, but for fraud. Since the Prestons had been receiving state payments for fostering children they were systematically abusing. The amount of money they'd collected over 6 years while starving kids was substantial. Detective Ortiz came to our house 3 days later, a woman in her 40s with a calm demeanor and kind eyes. She explained to Caleb that she was investigating what happened at the Preston house and wanted to hear his story. She promised he wasn't in trouble and what he said would help protect other kids. Caleb was hesitant but agreed to talk. Ortiz recorded the interview and asked specific questions about the daily routine, the point system, meals, punishments. Caleb answered in that flat, mechanical voice, describing abuse in terms the Prestons had taught him were normal discipline. Ortiz asked if he'd ever seen Mr. or Mrs. Preston hurt any of the other children physically. Caleb said, No, ma'am, they didn't hit. But sometimes kids who were really bad had to sleep in the basement instead of in their rooms. Ortiz leaned forward and asked what the basement was like. Caleb said, It was dark and cold. There were old mattresses on the floor. If you lost too many points or broke a big rule, you'd sleep down there for a night or a few nights. It was supposed to help you think about what you did wrong. Ortiz asked if Caleb had ever slept in the basement. He nodded and said, 3 times. Once because I asked for more food at dinner. That was against the rules. Once because I helped a younger kid who was crying, and that was interfering. Once because I got sick and threw up, and that made a mess. Each infraction met with isolation in a dark basement, a child sleeping on a dirty mattress alone as punishment for being hungry, being compassionate, being ill. Ortiz's expression remained professional, but I saw anger flash in her eyes. She asked if Mr. and Mrs. Preston ever told the kids what to say if anyone asked about the home. Caleb described the coaching sessions before caseworker visits, the threats about being sent somewhere worse, the praise they'd receive if they said the right things to investigators. Ortiz thanked Caleb for being brave and said his information was very helpful. After Ortiz left, Caleb asked me, "Am I going to get in trouble for telling?" I assured him absolutely not, that he did the right thing. He said, "But I told secrets about the family. Mr. Preston said family business stays private." I explained that when adults hurt kids, it stops being private business and becomes something that has to be reported so the kids can be safe. He processed this slowly, and I could see him trying to reconcile what I was saying with what he'd been taught. That night, he had nightmares for the first time since arriving. I heard him crying and went to his room. He was curled up on the floor next to his bed, shaking. I sat on the floor near him and asked if he wanted to talk about it. He said, "I dreamed Mr. Preston came and said I had to go back because I told lies about him. He said I was being defiant and I'd have to stand in the corner forever. I promised no one was taking him back there, that he was safe here, that Mr. Preston couldn't hurt him anymore." The investigation moved quickly once all 7 removed children started talking. Detective Ortiz pieced together 6 years of systematic abuse disguised as discipline. The Prestons had fostered 23 children during that time, each staying anywhere from a few months to 2 years before either being moved for failing the placement or aging out if they were older. The state had been paying the Prestons approximately $6,000 per month per child, meaning at peak capacity with 7 kids, they'd been collecting over $40,000 monthly while starving those children if they didn't meet arbitrary point requirements. The foster system's oversight had failed catastrophically, with caseworkers doing quarterly visits that the Prestons carefully staged, never looking deep enough to see the abuse happening in plain sight. Charges were filed against both Robert and Linda Preston in November. Child abuse, child endangerment, fraud, theft by deception, and multiple counts for each child involved. The district attorney, a sharp woman named Grace Wu, called me to discuss Caleb's potential testimony. She said, "Thomas, I won't lie to you. Having Caleb testify would strengthen the case significantly. But I won't force it if you think it'll re-traumatize him. We have enough from the other children and documentation to convict. But his testimony about the point system and the starvation would be powerful for the jury." I told her I'd talk to Caleb and Dr. Lin to see if he was emotionally ready to face the Prestons in court. Dr. Lin said Caleb was making progress in therapy, but was still fragile. Testifying could be empowering, showing him he had a voice and the system was listening, or it could be re-traumatizing, forcing him to relive abuse while the abusers watched. She suggested we prepare him for both possibilities and let him decide. When I asked Caleb if he wanted to tell the judge what happened at the Prestons, he was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, "Will the other kids have to tell too?" I said some of them would. He asked, "If I tell, will it help make sure no more kids have to live there?" I said yes, that was exactly what it would do. He took a deep breath and said, "Then I'll tell, but I'm scared." I promised I'd be with him the entire time. The trial was set for February, 4 months after the charges were filed. The Prestons pleaded not guilty, and their attorney argued they'd been providing structure and discipline to difficult children from traumatic backgrounds, that any punishment was appropriate and legal parenting. The defense strategy was to frame the children as unreliable witnesses with behavior problems who misunderstood normal discipline as abuse. Grace Wu prepared methodically, interviewing all 7 removed children, gathering medical records showing malnutrition and developmental delays, documenting the financial fraud. She also found 3 former foster children who'd been placed with the Prestons years earlier and had since aged out of the system. All 3 confirmed similar treatment: the point system, the hunger, the isolation, the psychological manipulation. Caleb and I attended the trial every day. The first week was jury selection and opening statements. Grace laid out the prosecution's case, explaining how the Prestons had created a system of control that inflicted severe psychological and physical harm on vulnerable children while profiting financially. The defense attorney, a man named Richard Something, argued that the Prestons were devoted foster parents who'd taken in 23 children over 6 years, providing structure to kids who desperately needed it, and that any discipline was reasonable and necessary given the challenges these children presented. Sitting next to Caleb, I felt him tense every time the defense made the Prestons sound like heroes. The second week brought testimony from the first removed children, kids ages 7 to 12 who'd been in the Preston home when the investigation started. Each child described the point system, the hunger, the corner times, the basement. The jury listened with increasingly horrified expressions. The defense attorney cross-examined aggressively, trying to poke holes in their stories, asking why they hadn't told caseworkers, implying they were lying for attention. Grace objected repeatedly, and the judge sustained most objections, but the defense was establishing their narrative that these were troubled kids with credibility problems. Caleb testified on day 9 of the trial. Grace had prepared him carefully, walking him through the process, explaining he just needed to tell the truth. We sat in the witness waiting room that morning and Caleb was shaking. He said, "What if I forget something? What if I say it wrong?" I told him he just needed to say what he remembered, that there was no wrong way to tell the truth. When his name was called, he walked into the courtroom with his shoulders back, trying to be brave. I sat in the gallery where he could see me. Grace asked him to state his name and age for the record. He said, "Caleb Thomas Whitmore, 8 years old." Hearing him use my last name, something that hadn't been legally finalized yet since this was still technically foster care, made my throat tight. Grace asked Caleb to describe what daily life was at the Preston home. He explained the point system in that same mechanical voice, listing all the ways you could earn or lose points, how many points were needed for each meal. Grace asked if he ever didn't have enough points to eat. He said, "Yes, ma'am, many times. Sometimes I'd only eat once in a day, sometimes not at all if I couldn't get enough points." Grace asked what it felt like to be that hungry. Caleb's voice got quieter. "It hurt a lot. Your stomach feels empty and tight and you get dizzy. It's hard to think about anything except food. Sometimes I'd dream about eating and then wake up and remember I still had to earn breakfast." Grace asked if Mr. and Mrs. Preston knew the children were hungry. Caleb said, "Yes, ma'am, that was the point. They said hunger would motivate us to do better." Grace asked about the corner punishments. Caleb described standing motionless for hours, not allowed to sit or lean or move. He said the longest he'd stood was 4 hours for crying about being hungry. Grace asked about the basement. Caleb described the cold, dark space with old mattresses where kids were sent for bigger infractions. He said he'd slept there 3 times, explaining each reason. The jury was visibly affected, several members looking at the Prestons with disgust. Then came cross-examination. The defense attorney approached Caleb with a gentle voice that felt manipulative. He said, "Caleb, you've been in several foster homes, is that right?" Caleb said, "Yes, sir." The attorney asked, "And have you had behavior problems in previous placements?" Caleb looked confused and said, "I don't know, sir." The attorney pressed, "Your records show you had difficulty following rules in other homes. Is that accurate?" Caleb said, "I guess so, sir." The defense attorney then asked, "Isn't it true that Mr. and Mrs. Preston were trying to help you learn discipline and structure?" Caleb hesitated and said, "That's what they said, sir." The attorney asked, "And they never hit you, did they?" Caleb said, "No, sir." The attorney said, "So really, they were just teaching you rules and consequences, which is what parents are supposed to do, correct?" Grace objected, arguing the question was leading. The judge sustained. The defense attorney tried a different angle. "Caleb, you're testifying today because your current foster father wants you to. Isn't that right?" Caleb looked at me in the gallery, confused. He said, "No, sir. I wanted to tell what happened." The attorney said, "But didn't Mr. Whitmore tell you that testifying would help keep you in his home?" Grace objected again, this time more forcefully. The judge warned the defense attorney about improper questions. After cross-examination, Caleb was excused. He walked back to me, and I saw he was crying silently. We left the courtroom and found a quiet hallway. I knelt down and said, "You were so brave. You did exactly what you needed to do." He said, "The lawyer made it sound I was lying. He made it sound the Prestons were trying to help us." I told him the lawyer's job was to defend the Prestons, but the jury understood the truth. What mattered was, he'd told his story honestly, and that was powerful. He nodded, but looked shaken. The rest of the trial continued with expert witnesses, including Dr. Sa Lin, who testified about the psychological impact of the Preston's methods, and a forensic accountant who detailed the financial fraud. The jury deliberated for 2 days before reaching a verdict: guilty on all counts. Robert and Linda Preston were convicted of 19 counts of child abuse, 7 counts of child endangerment, fraud, and theft. The judge scheduled sentencing for the following month and remanded both Prestons to custody. In the courtroom, as the verdicts were read, Linda Preston started crying, and Robert Preston sat stone-faced. I looked at Caleb, and his expression was complicated, not quite relief, more like exhausted vindication. Outside the courthouse, Grace Wu told the gathered media that this case represented a systemic failure where trusted foster parents had abused their position for years, while the oversight system missed or ignored the signs. She said reform was needed to protect foster children from similar abuse. Sentencing came in March. Grace Wu argued for maximum sentences, detailing the scope of harm inflicted on 23 children over 6 years. The judge heard victim impact statements from several of the children, including Caleb. He stood at the microphone, small and nervous, and read from a statement he'd written with Dr. Lin's help. He said, "The Prestons made me believe I didn't deserve to eat unless I was perfect. They made me think being hungry was my fault. They taught me that adults who hurt you are actually helping you. It took months living with someone who fed me every day no matter what, before I could even start to believe that food wasn't something I had to earn. I still have nightmares about standing in corners and sleeping in the basement. I still hide food sometimes because I'm scared I'll wake up and have to earn breakfast again. What the Prestons did wasn't discipline or structure. It was torture disguised as teaching." His voice was steady and strong, and I'd never been prouder of him. The judge sentenced Robert Preston to 25 years in state prison and Linda Preston to 20 years, with the possibility of parole after serving 80%. The judge also ordered them to pay restitution to the state for the foster care payments they'd received while abusing children, though realistically, that money would never be recovered. As the Prestons were led away, Linda looked back at the courtroom, and I saw no remorse in her expression, only resentment. Robert didn't look back at all. Outside the courthouse, several of the other foster families who'd taken in children from the Preston home gathered together. We'd formed a support network during the trial, parents trying to help kids heal from shared trauma. One father said, "At least they'll never hurt another child." It felt like hollow comfort. 23 kids had suffered because the system failed to protect them. Caleb's adoption was finalized in May, a bright moment after months of darkness. The judge who'd sentenced the Prestons wasn't the same judge who handled the adoption, but word had spread about the case. The adoption judge said, "Caleb, I've read about what you survived and how brave you've been. I'm proud to make official what's already true, that you are Thomas Whitmore's son, and he is your father. You deserve a family who loves you unconditionally." Caleb smiled, actually smiled, and said, "Thank you, ma'am." Later at the small celebration with close friends, someone asked Caleb how he felt about being officially adopted. He thought carefully and said, "I feel like I don't have to earn being part of this family anymore. I can just be here." That simple statement encompassed everything we'd worked toward. The aftermath continued for years. Caleb made progress in therapy, slowly learning to accept care without conditions. He stopped hoarding food after about 18 months, though he still asked permission for things more than necessary. His academic skills improved dramatically once he wasn't terrified of getting wrong answers. By 4th grade, he was reading at grade level and excelling in math. He made friends carefully, choosing kids who were kind and patient. He started playing soccer and discovered he was fast and competitive in healthy ways. He still had hard days when trauma responses surfaced, but they became less frequent and less intense. Dr. Lin said he was remarkably resilient, that his capacity to heal despite what he'd endured was testament to his strength. The foster care system underwent reforms following the Preston case, implementing more rigorous oversight and unannounced home visits. Rita Fernandez, who'd placed Caleb in the Preston home initially, left child services and became an advocate for foster care reform. She said she'd never forgive herself for missing the signs, though the reality was the Prestons had fooled many trained professionals. They'd been master manipulators who'd hidden their abuse behind a facade of structure and discipline. The system's failure had enabled them, but they were the ones who'd chosen to hurt vulnerable children for profit. Now at 12 years old, Caleb has been my son for 4 years. He's in 7th grade, plays on the school soccer team, and has a close group of friends. He still sees Dr. Lin monthly for maintenance therapy. He's starting to talk about the future, about high school, and maybe college someday. Last week at dinner, completely unprompted, he said, "Dad, thank you for always feeding me, even when I was really difficult at first." I told him he was never difficult, he was healing, and I was honored to be his father. He nodded and went back to his meal. But I saw him smile. That conversation, 4 years after the initial question that broke my heart, felt like coming full circle. My son had asked why we kept feeding him every day, and through years of patience, therapy, legal battles, and unconditional love, he'd finally understood the answer. Because he's my child, and he deserves to be cared for. No conditions attached, no points required, no earning necessary. That's what family means. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.